It was Rachel's 30th birthday that day. All her life, she had tried to be the perfect daughter, the best manager in the company, and a good wife. Rachel was a happy person. At least, she thought she was. She had always wanted to be a loving mother, not like her mother had been. Rachel's mother, Joanna, gave birth to her at 18. It was a case where she couldn't remember the child's biological father, and when her body started to gain weight after giving birth, it was all her unwanted daughter's fault. On her birthday, Rachel sat on the floor of her apartment, tears streaming down her cheeks. A half-empty bottle of cheap gin stood in front of her. The woman held a tiny teddy bear in her hands. The bear was supposed to be her son's first toy, but fate had decided otherwise. Rachel's son was stillborn. Doctors later said the baby had died after a couple of days. All that time, Rachel had carried him in her body, just talked to him and sang lullabies. She didn't know that her son was already dead. After the tragedy, she saw her husband only once. She had just returned from the hospital when John was packing his things. He didn't want to see her again. She had allowed his son to die, and she was the one to blame for it. Rachel had begged him to stay and promised to give him another child. He left only a bruise under her eye and $50 for the first time. It had been 2 weeks since his son's death. 2 weeks is 14 bottles of gin drunk, 1 bottle a day for a good night's sleep. Rachel promised herself that she would quit drinking after her birthday, but it's probably the last day of her life. Now she would finish the last bottle, go to the bathroom, and end her misery with one deep cut. And that would have happened if it hadn't been for the loud crying of a baby from behind the front door. The baby had been crying for about an hour, and his mother didn't seem to want to calm him down. She was probably lying next to her in a drug-induced stupor, and didn't understand what the screaming was preventing her from enjoying a killer dose of euphoria. Rachel knew the neighborhood she lived in. She was used to this situation. When would he finally shut up? Angrily, Rachel thought. The baby's screaming kept her from gathering her thoughts and completing one of the most important things in her life. The woman grabbed the bottle and firmly headed out into the hallway. She planned to teach the mopey mother a lesson and silence her annoying child. Rachel opened the door. To her surprise, no one was in the hallway, but the baby's crying didn't stop for a minute. "Where are you, baby?" the woman shouted angrily. "I feel disturbed. Do you hear me? Stop crying. I have to do it." This time, the crying came from the children's room. Her son, who had been dead for 2 weeks. Rachel had never gone in there since her tragic birth. She knew she wasn't ready to see the empty crib for the baby, the mountain of baby things and toys she'd so carefully chosen. The door was locked, and Rachel knew it. "How did you get in there? Get out of there. It's not your room." The woman ran for the key to the nursery, but her attention was drawn to the teddy bear she had been holding a few minutes before. For a moment, Rachel thought the toy was on the floor with blood on it. "I cut myself and I didn't see it." The thought flashed through her mind, but now she was worried about something else. How had the child get into the locked room? And where were his parents? Despite the alcohol she drank, Rachel still found the key and went to the nursery. The crying grew louder and louder. It seemed so monotonous and pitiful that it sent shivers down the woman's body. Rachel opened the door and tried to turn on the light, but it wouldn't come on. She squinted and looked around the room as best she could. At first glance, the room seemed empty. Rachel took out her phone and turned on her flashlight. She shined the light on the crib. To her surprise, the bed was slightly flattened. By then, the crying had subsided into a light sobbing. Intuitively, the woman guessed that the sound was coming from the back, from the side where the mirror hung. A chill ran through her body. Rachel was paralyzed with fear. She had been afraid of mirrors since she was a little girl. That was why she had begged her husband to move the antique mirror from the baby's room to another place. But he was always busy. Rachel felt a light, cold touch on her shoulder. Of course, out of fear, her imagination might have fooled her. But the sensation of the presence of someone behind her never left her, as if something was breathing down her back. She had never been so frightened in her life. The woman, trembling, turned toward the mirror. The sounds of a child's crying were already coming from all directions. She couldn't tell if the outcry was real or the result of her imagination diluted with too much alcohol. Rachel pointed the flashlight at the mirror hanging on the wall. To her surprise, the lantern's light did not reflect off the mirror. She stepped closer and found herself in front of the dark, empty frame. The crying stopped. There was complete silence in the room. Rachel had never imagined that silence could be so frightening. She stood staring intently into the mirror. What was she trying to see there? All she could see were the fuzzy outlines of her face. Was it her own? The beginning was too small for a grown man. Could it have been her son? Was it his way of telling her something? Or had grief finally driven her mad? Either way, she was glad to see her child for a moment. "Mommy, I'm cold." A child's voice behind her caught her off guard. "Mommy, don't leave me. What have I done wrong to you? Why don't you and Daddy love me?" The voice came from all directions. The children's musical merry-go-round that hung over the cribs suddenly turned on, and the toy ponies began to dance to the merry lullaby. Rachel came to her senses in the hallway. She didn't remember running from the room screaming. She didn't remember if she had locked the nursery door. All that remained in her memory was the monotonous voice of a child, the voice of a creature she had mistaken for her son. It begged her to stay with him. What if it was her child? When the shock passed, Rachel found the phone and dialed the emergency number with trembling fingers. She didn't know how to explain what had happened to her to the operator, so she said, "Come over. I've been sick." Rachel hung up the phone and went into the kitchen. Before the police arrived, she wanted to smoke a cigarette and finish her open bottle of gin. 10 minutes later, Rachel was finishing her third cigarette in the kitchen, trying to find a logical explanation for what had happened in the nursery. Could her pills have caused such hallucinations? Her psychiatrist had warned that there could be side effects. Perhaps her ex-husband was seeking revenge and wanted to drive her crazy. But that relentless crying was as accurate as the glass of gin in her hand. She remembered the teddy bear thrown on the floor and the blood she had seen on it. Rachel scrutinized her body and found not a single cut on it. Her thoughts were interrupted by the stomping of children's feet and loud laughter coming from the room. Rachel was no longer afraid. Alcohol mixed with adrenaline made people braver. She stepped into the room and looked around. The teddy bear, which should have been lying on the floor, was now lying on her bed. Rachel could see traces of caked blood on it. If this were my husband's doing, I'd kill him and then kill myself, just like I'd planned. Such thoughts crossed the woman's mind, especially since the police are probably already on their way. Rachel laughed. She found it amusing how quickly a loving wife turned into a desperate woman ready to kill her husband, as the priest had said at their wedding. For better or for worse, till death do you part. A loud phone call interrupted her thoughts. The number was classified. "Mommy, why didn't you and Daddy want me? You said you loved me. You said you would never leave me. Now I'm here alone. It's freezing and damp here. Mama, could you come and get me?" she heard on the phone. Hysteria hit Rachel. She wanted to have this baby. She had been planning it. She had lied to her husband about taking birth control pills. She thought that having a baby was her only chance to hold on to her husband, to make him forget his countless mistresses, which she guessed about. She thought that if she gave him a son, her husband would love her again, as he had in the first year of their relationship. But when John found out about the pregnancy, he became furious. He persuaded her to get an abortion. He didn't sleep at home for weeks, but he always came back. Since then, their relationship has only gotten worse. Her husband had never laid a hand on her before, but one day, everything changed. He came home late at night. He was very drunk. All Rachel did was ask where he was. 2 punches followed in response. One was in the face. The other was in the stomach. Rachel didn't remember how long she had been on the floor. The pain in her stomach didn't subside until hours later. She was afraid to call an ambulance because the doctors would call the police. She did not tell anyone about what had happened, not even her mother. It happened a few days before she went into premature labor. That's when their son died. Rachel sat motionless on the bed. The phone was beside her, and the baby's voice continued to come from the speaker. But the woman could no longer make out anything. Her eyes had become glassy. "I'm coming to you, my baby. Soon we'll be together," Rachel whispered. It was as if she were under hypnosis. Her son's desperate cries echoed over and over in her head, bringing her unbearable moral pain. She wanted to get rid of it all, to cut that voice out of her head once and for all. Rachel took the teddy bear in her hand and resolutely headed for the bathroom. The police arrived the following day. The tenants of the house reported hearing women screaming all night from the apartment next door. Their testimony made it known that the woman had not left the house for 2 weeks, sometimes rampaging, but last night was the loudest in all that time. Some neighbors even thought a baby was crying behind the wall. The police found the woman in the bathroom. She was dead. An empty bottle of gin, 2 empty bottles of tranquilizers, and a bloody teddy bear were found next to her body.